Welcome to today's special presentation and program, what is called here a celebration of arts activism, a conversation with artist Mark Thomas Gibson. My name is Brandon Jacobs, and I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the Shipley School. And I'm excited to welcome you all here for, again, our very special program. I just wanted to give a couple real quick announcements regarding today's program before I pass it off to our next members of our presentation, who will then introduce our special artist. So I just wanted you to know that today's program will be recorded, as you saw on the opening screen there. And if you have any questions or any concerns regarding any of the formatting or having any issues at all, please feel free to use the chat or the chat feature here today to connect with Ali Schwartz, who will connect you if you have any issues as well too. So I just want to let you know that's available if you need to today. So like I said, I'm going to introduce in just a second Paige and Lee, who are going to introduce our artists. And after their introduction and after Mark's talk, I will be back to then introduce our panelist questioners today, who will be talking to you and asking questions of Mark later on. So without further ado, I want to introduce Paige and Lee. Paige is a Shipley alumna and the founder and curator of the West Collection. Lee is actually the director of the West Collection, and they will be introducing our artists here today. So Paige and Lee, feel free to take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paige West. Thank you, Brandon. And we're super happy to be here today and feel very lucky to have Mark here to speak with all of us today. Thank you also to Shipley for the opportunity today to gather on Zoom. And I'm here just to give a little context. Lee, my partner in art crime, is also going to do an introduction of Mark. So as Brandon said, I graduated from Shipley in 1986, a long time ago. And my career in art is definitely thanks to a woman at Shipley named Miss Wagner, who was extremely influential in my early years. So thank you, Miss Wagner. So I've been collecting art for the past 20 years. Lee and I both have curated a collection that we've put together that is privately owned but housed publicly. The goal of the collection, it's a contemporary art collection. The goal has always been to show the work, to share the artists with the broader public. The Speer Gallery at Shipley is one way we've been able to do that. We have worked with them for years in showing curated selections of the collection to the students, faculty, parents, whomever are at the space. And we've really enjoyed this opportunity to do that with them, and thank Shipley for the opportunity, and also congratulate them on their courage for showing work, sometimes controversial work, and definitely mature work. Showing the work in a high school is really above and beyond, and I'm super proud to call Shipley a school that I attended. So we currently, the show that is up in the current space, Mark's work is by far one of the most powerful pieces in that show. I was able to meet Mark. Lee introduced me to Mark, I think it was about a year ago. I think it was last fall that we were able to sit down together in a small conference room, and Mark shared his work with us and his story, and it was a very moving and wonderful experience, and I fell in love immediately with his work. It was extremely poignant and resonated with me at the time, even more so now, I think, because of the crazy political circus we live in, and that we're all witness to right now. Mark's work really strikes a chord, and so I'm excited for you to hear from Mark today, and I'll turn it over to Lee to introduce Mark.
I just want to say thanks, Paige, but many thanks to Tanya O'Donnell, the amazing art teacher there at Shipley, who we worked with on this exhibition and who now runs Speer. We've had a great experience there over the last 15 years, whether it was Mr. Barris or Tanya this year. They've had a lot of courage to borrow important works from Paige in this series of shows, and none more than this show. This show is power to the extreme. And Paige and I recapped after we made the loan, and we were like, this is the best show we've ever done. And she's made loans to the Tate, to the Whitney. We just did we just loaned works to the Guggenheim last summer. So just to put that in context, we think this is the best show we've ever loaned. So without further ado, Mark Gibson is an amazing artist, superpower, and we're so lucky to have him in Philadelphia. So he went to Cooper Union. He then went to grad school at Yale. He then taught at Yale. And then Tyler attracted him from Yale to come here, gave him a tenure track, and now he's stuck in Philadelphia forever, and an amazing resource to our city. Mark, please join us on the Zoom. We can't wait to hear what you have to say today.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's actually an honor. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Paige, for asking me to be here as well. Thank you, Tanya, for helping me put on the show. Melissa, thank you for contacting me and helping to coordinate all of this. Everyone that I've met and have dealt with inside the school has been extremely helpful. And it's something I actually, as a young artist, didn't get much of. And as an older artist, and I say that because I was born in 1980, moving to Philadelphia so far has been like a real shift and change in my whole life. Meeting Paige, I think it was almost like a week this week. I almost feel it was like this week last year. It really opened up some doors for me because it made me see that there were people who are interested in art, interested in the artists who actually make that art, and to have the conversation with them. It was kind of very quickly in the conversation I had with Lee and Paige that I realized that, oh, I can just talk. I don't need to angle this or shift the focus or change the perception of something. It was really like, no, just be yourself and have a conversation. And if that's what this school is offering you, and if this is what the school is trying to do, then I am all 100,000% behind it. Quick note, so I started art school at a very, very early age. I started art school when I was in the 5th grade. I went to an art elementary school, and then I went to an art middle school, and then I went to an art high school, and then college, and everything else. And the art high school I went to was called New School of the Arts, and it was a place where we had 4 disciplines, basically: theater, music, dance, and visual arts, painting, usually fall into that category. And there I expressed or saw for the first time a group of people who were willing to like allow us to be ourselves, and people openly hugging and people openly like laughing and talking. And it was like nothing I'd ever kind of experienced previous to that. And it's very actually rare in education for spaces to actually give students that opportunity to find themselves, to question, to push things, to show them the things that the world really has to offer. It's sad, but that's not the case for everyone. So I'm very happy to be here today in an institution that feels that that's a necessity. So if I can get screen control, I'll begin my talk. So, and I'll give you my little overview of everything. All right. Okay. What I do not like about screen share PowerPoint is that usually my talk has a lot of turns and twists and stuff. And so now I don't get to do as twisty because you get to see where I'm going to go. So this talk was something I developed a while back, and I developed it actually on the way to doing a talk on Halloween one year because it tapped into something that that I think is extremely important to understand about me. That I'm actually very, very terrified of werewolves. Now, when I say that, I know you probably weren't expecting the conversation to start there today, but it's actually true. From an early age, my sister, who was 9 years older than me, showed me horror films in the 80s. So like when, if you guys know about, Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, if you're like 4 or 5 years old and all your teenage older kids around you are all watching that kind of stuff, and they sometimes think it's funny to show like the little kid thing. But for me, the thing that really got to me was this film, American Werewolf in London. In the film, this character, he is attacked on the moors in England, and his friend is murdered, and he lives, but he's basically like almost dies, you know, like he's torn apart within an inch of his life. And what I started to realize as I got older, what I found so fascinating about werewolves, and outside of me being terrified of them, was that they were a perfect analogy for me about the experience of America, especially as a Black man. I started thinking a lot about the idea of blood trauma, about the inherited trauma of slavery, of violence, of institutions that have been rigged and formulated to oppress, and how that plays upon one's body and how it plays upon one's mind. What's very significant about this film and then its change, the wolf's transformation scene, is that his face extends, and they use like this makeup prop, and then they put like animatronics behind it, and his face like kind of pulls forward. But generally through the actual process of this person transforming, he's a human being, like in his face. His body's cracking, his bones are snapping, his limbs are extending, everything else, and he can witness it the whole time. And the whole time we can hear him screaming, and you can hear him dealing with the idea of that his body is going through this transformation. Then us, the viewer, then connect with him. We connect with his eyes, we connect with what's going on with him in that moment. Often, and more sadly, often more now than ever, we see this. We watch videos, or we see in moments where people are in this moment of life and death, and we can connect to their face, we connect to their eyes, we can connect to their humanity. This is a part of being an artist. There will be things that you will think about, things that will be in your brain, things that just kind of click around and bump around in your brain that will, for some reason, not ever dislodge themselves. A part of the game of being an artist is to learn how to actually have that conversation with what that thing is, and why does it sit with you? Why is it so significant? Another big pivotal moment in my childhood is that I was a super Michael Jackson fan. And my sister was like, well, Michael Jackson has this new music video. I think it'd be really great for you to see it. Like, come on. And I remember her taking me to the room, and, you know, to the living room and the big TV. And it's like, let's watch this. And it was Thriller. So I remember distinctly seeing this change happen. And I remember distinctly thinking in my head, everything I knew is off. Now, this wouldn't be the only time in my life that I'd ever have that feeling, and have it more often than I would like to have it. But it really stood out to me watching this transformation, watching this power, this new thing take place. The person who pretty much throughout his whole entire career, to this album and to this video, has always been seen as this lovable character. And then all of a sudden, this idea, or this possibility that there's another person there, that there's another body there. But then on the other side of that, the flip side of it, and something that you have to often come to terms with in this culture, within American culture, and pretty much all world culture, but our culture very much so, the perception of what you look like and how you are perceived from the outside really does affect the way people receive you. Just this morning, I was actually walking my dog, my little cute little dog, and this woman walked past me, and she like just looked down. She like averted her eyes so I couldn't make eye contact with her. I'm a 6'3" African-American man. And my experience watching my experience change as I grew, as I transformed. I would notice that people would smile, how cute you are, all these other things. And then by the time I was around 18, 19, people stopped smiling. My body has transformed into something that people now are aware of, they are afraid of, they don't know what to do with. That will affect your brain. That will affect your mind. So, fun fact, both American Werewolf in London and Thriller were both directed by John Landis. Side note. So I leave you with this last image before I go into my own work, just because I think that these moments of transformation and then recalibrating and rethinking how things can play and how things operate, how things have been presented to us, and how we can actually reestablish and reorganize them is a huge principle to my work. The idea of thinking through misdirection is a big part of my work as well. My first show out of undergrad, out of grad school, I did the show and it was all about the Alamo, and I read all these books and I was doing these black on black paintings, and it didn't go extremely well. But the work I did right after that, when I returned to color, had a lot to do with my ideas and my feelings around American history. And I've always had an interest in American history. So the work was called Tonto Got Smart. It was the first kind of sequential based work I was making. All of it's done by hand. It's not a print. It's just me painting, drawing acrylic on paper. And the idea is that around the time, this was like 2014, it was announced that like Johnny Depp would be playing Tonto in the new Lone Ranger film. And for someone who grew up with a family who's has a mixed diasporic background, and I was kind of raised to understand that there's all these cultures and heritages and identities and peoples that usually within inside the canon of American film and television and writing are misconstrued. And Tonto would be a very heavy symbol of that. Tonto kind of almost comes out of this tradition of red face, where you have white actors portraying Native people, very similar to blackface, having white actors portray African American or people from the African diaspora. So my idea was that to think about Tonto's perspective of every day being on the range with Lone Ranger and going like, what is this guy talking about? You know, what is this all? What is my relationship to this person? And getting to the point where he decides to kill the Lone Ranger. This one's called Inside Job. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, the horse is in on it. So the idea that usually in our situations, and if you are a person of color, if you're a woman, if you're someone who feels marginalized, if you're LGBTQ, Asian, whatever, you know, like any of the plethora of people who could be marginalized within the side of American society, we do that well. If you're one of those people, you also know the experience of being on the outside of watching another person experiencing those moments. Those are those moments where I think that if we were to grow them, we could actually grow empathy. We could open the conversation around those experiences, that they don't need to happen, but when they do, we need to talk about them. We need to expand our consciousness around what those things are and what they mean, because we all have experienced it at some point. So I was going through a little weird time in my work. I didn't really know what I was going to do with myself. So I'd been making work previously that dealt a lot with like the antebellum era and dealing with the idea of manifest destiny in the West. But I didn't have an ending to my story. So on a trip to Philadelphia, at the time I was living in New York City, my wife took me to PAFA. And we saw this incredible painting by Benjamin West, Death on a Pale Horse. It's like 176 inches by 301 inches. Very epic story about how the painting was almost lost in a fire and all this other stuff, but you know, a lot of time for that. That said, Benjamin West in this painting, Benjamin West was a painter of the founding fathers of this country. He also painted equestrian paintings. He painted things that had a little bit more timidity to them. They weren't very epic paintings, to say the least. But in this painting, if you get close to it, you can see these giant brushstrokes. You can see all this movement. You can see all this stuff. And this is near the end of Benjamin West's life. And I kept thinking to myself when I saw this painting, if this individual can push himself at the end of his life to try something new, to push the conversation, why can't I? Also, I started thinking, growing up in the South as a Southern Baptist, the idea of the rapture, the idea of the end times, or any of that kind of stuff was always around me. So I was like, well, in American culture, this idea of the end of the world is always a big thing. So why don't I just represent that? That's how I end my narrative, by actually bringing about the end of the world. So I started making these works. So these are acrylic on paper. They're 72 by 40 inches. I'm using multiple like types of ink. I'm using acrylic paint, and I'm kind of playing off of some of the characters that were represented in Benjamin West's work. And I'm also starting to like bring the werewolf thing more into focus and making these characters like, you know, cursed by that. So I have like Andrew Jackson as Conquest. I have George Washington as War. I have a cowboy with smallpox blankets as the plague or pestilence. A little fun note, or not that fun, but you know, Hudson blankets, you see them every once in a while on people's like couches and whatever. They're very popular kind of blanket. Hudson blankets, that same company, were the same blankets that were supplied to the U.S. government or purchased by the U.S. government that were then given to Native Americans carrying smallpox. So this weird thing that happens a lot in American history, this thing about art and the way that we build and develop language inside of art and art practices, comes from looking and seeking and understanding and pulling apart information and then reassessing it and then reinstituting it in other spaces where we can then make it operational for our own ideas. So that is a very important drawing for me. It's a drawing I'll probably never sell. It's this whole stack of drawings actually that are from a very specific night that I would never ever sell, and I rarely ever show them to people. So on the night when Eric Garner's murderers got off, I was living in New York City. When I was younger, probably around closer to your age, and I first moved to New York City, there was this guy, a mayor named Rudolph Giuliani. Rudolph Giuliani was a very particular person at that time and has only become more that person for the greater national and world community recently. There had been several shootings and murders of African American or people from the African diaspora, heinous acts done to Black bodies while he was the mayor of New York, and little was done, if not anything at all. So I protested a lot during that era of my life. And then when I'd got out of grad school and I was a little bit older, I was like, well, I don't really do that anymore. The whole Eric Garner thing that was going on, and Trayvon Martin, who actually grew up in the neighborhood that I grew up in Miami, Florida, Carroll City, which is now called Miami Gardens. I had a moment when the cops got off and it snapped in my brain, and this click happened where I but I really felt, and through my bones and through, this word, that's that, just popped in my head. Like, that's that. And that's that wasn't the snapping of like whether or not I mattered or whether or not I should do anything. It was like, know what? This world is played in a certain way, and I not that I adjust myself to it, but I make myself hyper aware of it. And because of that hyper awareness of it, that means I can do whatever I want. Double consciousness, something that it's brought up by W.B. Du Bois, is a perception that many people of color have. And I think almost everyone does actually kind of have it, but varying degrees depending on your situation and how marginalized you are. But what allows for me is to see the world from multiple vantage points. And with that, it almost makes me kind of culturally bilingual. I use that to function and move through this world. That was this moment where I was like, you know what? I don't need to try to figure out making art that plays to this person or plays to that person. I no longer have to become seeking about like, what should I do here? What should I do there? I could just be me, 100% me, whatever that means. So I made these drawings, 40 drawings in one night. I'm what they call prolific. I make lots of work. So it's actually sort of difficult for me to edit myself down for talks because, so I've made in the last year, probably since this January, about 90 works, either on paper or on canvas, by hand. That's just kind of me. On a good clip, I remember one year I made 140 paintings in 4 months. And that's because I process outside of myself. I process in the work that I make. That's not to just be like, you make a lot of stuff, so ergo it's good. No, a lot of it was bad, very bad. But it was just that I needed to see and I needed to process. Around this time when, after all that event happened, I started rethinking what painting meant for me and what it could do. And at the time, there was this movement of painting, kind of all over abstraction work that had been being made. And I was thinking a lot around the idea of why everyone was talking about abstract expressionism, or why was everyone moving in this way of not kind of rehashed abstract expressionism and rehashed like all over painting without really any dialogue about what that meant and nothing about the sublime. A lot of vague conversation about interiority and exteriority. Not that those two things don't matter. I don't like vagueness. So I was like, well, I'm going to put language in it. I'm going to do the no-no. I'm going to put words in my paintings. I'm going to put characters in my paintings, put cartoony characters in my paintings. And it was all about like, I'm going to do the no-no. I'm going to do the thing you're not supposed to do. So Some Monsters Loom Large was a phrase that I kept thinking a lot about. And this one is Some Monsters Loom Large Spotlight. If you were to see the painting in person, you would actually see in the spotlight, there's cops like beating down protesters. So the idea of thinking about streets or avenues or names or places that in the bricks or in the mortar or in the history of that environment, especially in a place like Philadelphia, you have spaces of revolution, spaces of like workers' fights, spaces of conflict. I mean, we've seen it on our streets here just in this last summer, so like uprisings, things like that occur. That's that fall. Was a painting where I was trying to figure out like more vibrant color, but at the same time, I was thinking about this kind of nexus space, the moment of that snap and what that could mean. Is that a place of freedom as a place, rather than a place of failure? Sort of sense of self. A lot of idea around the ideas of how I'm seen, how I perceive myself, or that possibility of walking in front of a mirror and actually not recognizing the body that I know I am versus the body that those see me as. Around this time, I was working for this artist, a little known artist named Carol Walker. Many people have not heard of her. If you don't know the name, you should probably look her up. At the time, I was working on this large project with her at the Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn, New York, and she's a genius. Literally is a genius. Won a MacArthur Genius Grant, but also is actually technically a genius, I would imagine. While working for her, we were talking, and one day she said to me, like, you know what, you should make a comic book, Mark. And I said, you should make a comic book, Kara, you can do anything. She said, well, no, Mark, you should make a comic book. And I said, well, you should make a comic book. And then she said it to me one more time. And I said, you know what, maybe I should listen to her. After all, she's a genius. And I said to her, I don't really know how to make a comic book. And she said, well, you just draw one drawing and then you draw the next. And I said, okay, because you're a genius, I'll listen to you. So that created this book, Some Monsters Loom Large. I started off with one drawing and then drew another, and by the end of it, I had over 400 drawings. So I edited it down and ended up making a book of 350 drawings, and these are all the characters that came about because of it. This is the actual first drawing, and that's the second drawing. And a lot of it had to do with growing up in Florida and growing up in Miami in particular, a place where tourism is a very big part of the culture there. So you, as a brown body in that type of space, you're usually seen as a part of the AstroTurf or as a part of the ambiance of the tourist experience for people from the Midwest and people who've never quite seen people like you or people who look like your friends. So they tend to stand around and gawk at you. But that kind of creates a little bit odd ennui, if you will, or a sense of despair if you are an individual who's being perceived that way. So in the narrative, the character is looking out, a giant mountain pops out of the water, this thing I call the Demon Mountain. It's actually kind of taken from the Night on Ball Mountain from Fantasia. That was a very pivotal image for me as a child. He climbs inside this mountain, and inside the mountain, he goes into the mountain, we go inside of him, and we go inside of his ear, and we see this little worm, this little earworm that's inside of his head. And the earworm is basically trying to kill him, trying to reach his heart to kill him before the cycle continues. He is shown a show about the history of America. In this show, he sees a Native American being devoured by a pilgrim. Now, when I first showed an image similar to this while I was in grad school, I had a lot of pushback, but later I brought in the journals of the individual who wrote from that settlement of early pilgrims who came to America, who didn't know how to farm, who didn't know how to work the land, who knew nothing about the space that they were moving to other than the fact that they were fleeing England. In that journal, he depicts or he writes about the digging up of a Native American burial ground and then eating the corpse of that person due to the fact they were starving to death. They had also already had eaten possibly some of their children and some other stuff. When I first told my class that and told other people that, they didn't believe me. And then later, just almost a week later, there was an article in the newspaper that talked about going to that settlement and then actually finding a young girl's skull that had been scraped out, from being like devoured. This is American history. I think it's very interesting to think about Western canon of film and television when you look at, you know, images of Southeast Asia or images of Africa and images of South America, and you always see cannibalism as a thing. But when you really kind of get into American history, cannibalism actually is a big part of American history, especially for the early settlers of American history. So in that brooch, that moment of devouring this curse, this manifest destiny monster, which then like turns this person into a werewolf, is like the first thing that happens in my narrative. And then that blood trauma gets passed on to them, to Black bodies who become slaves. And then this travels through the West. At this time, I started making these little drawings. All the little drawings were about 7 by 11 inches. And then I was making these larger paintings, which were 60 by 40 inches. And then actually, if this is a properly color corrected image, inside those stars, it says some monsters loom large, and those little dots they composed to make that. The character is then like ripped out of this scene, and then he ends up in the Southwest, or ends up actually in Texas outside of the Alamo. He's hunted. He ends up at the Alamo, at the big battle. This giant creature, the Manifest Destiny monster, chases him there through time. He gets like, he watches all this horrible evisceration. He's killed, and then he wakes up again in the next scene. So I'm learning at the time while I'm making all this work, and this is something that might happen for a lot of you as young artists, is that as you're developing things and you're making things, they're starting to, what do you do with them? What do I do with a drawing? And sometimes the drawing becomes a painting, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes a painting isn't a drawing. You have to learn what that is. But something else started happening with these images. When I started making the book, I'd always had this issue with my work about connecting with other people and feeling like I wasn't connecting with other people, that they didn't understand what I was trying to convey. When I made the book, for the first time at my opening, people were coming up to me and like, I understand what you're talking about. I feared that too. I get it. My activism, if I were to say if I were to put myself into that's a high category for me. It's about connecting people to ideas. It's about shedding light on things that in our culture tend to want to be forced into the shadows. So that's where I would probably put myself if I were to put myself in that high honor. And I mean, even being asked to be here under that pretense to me is like extremely meaningful and large for me. So in the story, the character ends up pretty much in a modern time, and it's another protest is going on, and people are being attacked, and this giant horn goes off. And in this book, every page is image to image to image, and it's actually the first book I made was 100% to the scale of the original drawing. This giant horn goes off the first time you hear sound in the entire book, and basically it's the horn of the angels, and the world happens, and we as humans, we don't figure it out in time. We don't get past our issues. Looking at a lot of like German plague art, I have very deep interest in European etching traditions and printing traditions, very, very into French 19th century printmaking and etching traditions, especially when it comes to caricature and other political art. Another thing, a principle that started coming up in my painting was this idea of the push and the pull, meaning I'm going to paint something or I'm going to render something that is either optically pushing your eye out, but at the same time, there's something about it that makes you want to look at it. And so I'm really still kind of interested in that, even with the side of content, is like, how do I do this push-pull? At the time, also, I started working on this project with this artist, William Villalongo, for a project we did called Black Pulp, about print media in African-American or African diasporic culture. If you've heard, I kind of do that thing where I'll say African-American, then I say African diasporic, because, you know, growing up in this country and kind of seeing yourself as a sector of something, and then growing up and getting older and then realizing that you're a part of a much larger, much more vibrant, much more interesting community, it was something that has taken time for me to really kind of address, especially where I came from in Florida, because where I grew up at a certain time, it was like, if you were African-American, you were one thing. If you were Jamaican-American, that's a very different thing. If you're Bahamian-American, that's a different thing. And if you're Haitian-American, you usually caught hell. And it was all a lot to do with the idea of colonization and your proximity to your colonizer. And that was still something still playing out on my life. And I'm not that much older than you. So that said, back to this. The piece on the left is an image from a comic book called Judgment Night. And it was a print from EC Comics. It came out in 1953, or at least the image that I'm talking about that's being contested came out in 1953. And in the 1950s, there was a thing called the Comic Code Authority that basically changed the way comic books and the language of comic books and what they meant and what should be inside of them. So things like matricide, things like werewolves, vampires, and black people were like things you shouldn't have in comics, especially as protagonists. So this comic book basically has a spaceman from the Federation of Planets. He ends up going to this planet where there's robots, orange and blue robots, and of course they're racist. So he tells them that you can't be a part of the Federation of Planets, and he leaves. And as he leaves, he takes off his helmet, and for the first time in the comic, you see that he's a black man. The judge that oversaw the Comic Code Authority saw that, and he calls up Gaines, the publisher of EC Comics, and says, "You can't run this." Gaines has some choice words for the man and hangs up the phone. Then the judge calls back and says again, "You can run it, but you have to take the stars out of his skin." Now, as a young artist, I want you to understand, people understand what you're doing. They may not always speak to it. They may not always want to address it. But images have power, significant power. Ed Gaines hung up the phone, or said some more choice words, hung up the phone, and he ran it as is. Because he understood that what he was trying to say, this is the man of the future, or it's the possibility of being one of the people of the future, and that this person is connected to the stars, to the universe, universal power. So at the same time I was researching and looking into that, the Force Awakens trailer had dropped, and it was around actually, it would be like this week, it was like Thanksgiving several years ago. And that thing dropped. I was like, oh my God, as I was a kid who grew up, I saw, Return of the Jedi in the theater when I was like 4 or 5 years old. And I was so excited. And then Twitter started blowing up with like, why is there a black stormtrooper? Stormtroopers aren't black. Why is this thing? What are they doing? Blah, 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 da, 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 And I had to come to terms with the idea that like, are we prepared for black heroes? This was prior to Black Panther, but we're not going to go into that, but yeah. This is prior to Black Panther. So this idea of black bodies inside of science fiction, being the black protagonist inside of science fiction. Are we prepared for that? Can we allow for that? Can my body be a hero? Will you follow me on my journey? Will you invest in that? John Boyega would say, no, you can't. Because he talks about now, after the films have come out, that he had a very much more pivotal role, and he was told that he was going to do some really incredible things inside of this narrative. And by the end of it, he's been totally marginalized as a character who you don't know if he has powers. You don't know if he's in love with Rey. You don't know anything really about him by the end of it. Complete aside. But imagery and characters matter, especially to me. So we create black pulp. We have works by Emory Douglas. We have works by Robert Colescott. We have Emory Douglas is someone you should all know. If you don't know who Emory Douglas is, look him up. Just like I said, Kara Walker, look him up. Look her up. We had a work by Derek Adams. We had a work by Ellen Gallagher. It was a beautiful show. And what we were doing was thinking about print matter and print content, or Oliver Harrington. And then how can we look at this idea of the arms race, or visual arms race was a word that something I quoted for the show. It's like the New Negro, or the Fire magazine, or Fire, different books, Opportunity, The Crisis, like different organizations trying to figure out what is the African-American body, what is the Black diasporic body in the 20th century, and how do we fight and create and redefine what that means. So I started making my second book, Early Retirement. Early retirement had a lot to do with the idea of whether or not we can actually create a utopia anymore. Does that even matter to people anymore? So I made this book along similar lines as the previous book. This time I actually had backing behind it from Edition Patrick Fry out of Switzerland, an art book maker. And I made my first book. In it, an election happens and Trump wins. And I originally had taken his name, his name was drawn in there, and I took it out because I do believe in the idea of reproduction of imagery and its power. Character falls, he gets really angry, he curses at the gods, he's hit on the head with ball lightning, he's transported into another dimension. While he's in that other dimension, he's shown something called the truth. He comes back to our world and he starts showing people the truth. And the narrative is kind of long, and it all ends up in the end of it in Bucks County. And they're like, after a giant tidal wave, and these two main characters have to have this conversation around what is utopia or utopic thinking. What does it really mean beyond the idea of just utopic thinking? And for me, when I make a book or when I make a piece of art, that's when I actually start to understand and come up with a real dialogue for what that thing means for me. Paintings generated from that show led into these, the storyline that when I present the show, this was a piece that I made after Charlottesville and the events that took place there. I was actually in a residency when I made this piece. This other work, Trump's entry into Washington, was all a part of a show I called Early Retirement. Boom, boom, boom. So I was doing a lot of drawing, rehashing, and I've been doing that a little bit more lately again, like kind of reestablishing imagery. This large piece, Believe Me, it's about 55 by 110 inches. It has a lot to do with the idea of information and how we're receiving it. And as young people, I'm sure how you may be receiving it. Short story. Years ago, I had a friend who got married in France, in Provence, and there was a guy, and his name was Bodine, and he was a magician, and he would have this bit that he would do while he was doing a whole act, and he would say, I go around from town to town, and I ask people, or people ask me, Bodine, how do you do it? And I thought it was so cheesy when he said that. And then he goes, he starts performing, and he does a little trick, and he does a balloon thing, and then he like pops it, and a card comes out, and he's like, Bodine, how do you do it? He does another trick where he takes an orange, he cuts it in half, he pulls out a card. No, Boudin, how did you do it? By the second time, people start saying it. And then by the third time, he does the thing, is this your card? And everyone goes like crazy. And they go, Boudin, how did you do it? And later I said to him, Boudin, oh, how'd you do it? But Boudin, what was that? And he says, oh, that's just group hypnosis. All you need is a phrase or something that you say, you play it out, you put it out there. It says in the subconscious. If you keep pushing at it, people will start to say it themselves, and then it becomes a reality. So it can be, Bodine, how'd you do it? Lock her up. Believe me. The election's a hoax. It's rigged. You say it enough times, people will start to say it themselves, and they'll start to enact it. Words, images have power, significant power. Never underestimate that power. Never think it's just going to go away. It doesn't. So I was asked to do a show in a nuclear bunker in Switzerland. Switzerland had a policy where they wanted to put every man, woman, and child inside of a bunker during the Cold War, just in case if like we were shooting like nuclear bombs at Russia and they were shooting them at America and just happened, one happened to hit them. So they wanted to be able to put every man, woman, and child in the entire country inside of these bunkers all over. And this town that I was in at the time, this bunker could hold 15,000 people. And so they wanted to do an art show in there. And I chose to do it inside of the prison, inside of the bunker, because of course, if you're going to be in a post-apocalyptic nuclear world, you need a prison. A phrase that I use often in my work. So I just went down there, didn't tell anyone who I was. I just wanted to watch people look at my work and look at my drawings and look at the story and listen to what they had to say about it. It was kind of interesting. Then I also had the show in Stockholm in Sweden, the show called The Gauntlet. Had a lot to do with this idea of aftermath. Another side note about me. So I grew up in Florida during Hurricane Andrew. My dad became the postmaster of a town called Homestead, which was extremely, it was basically flattened after Hurricane Andrew. And I attended Cooper Union in 1998, 2002, in my senior year of school, my first day of class was when 9/11 happened. And also when I became a professor at Yale, I was the head of this diversity and gender diversity committee, and then Trump became president. I've always been in odd, weird places when certain things happen that kind of reorient everything. And what I've learned is that when that happens, there's this sort of moment where everything is completely quiet. A pause happens. In that pause, in that breath, anything can happen, I think. And I think if we look for those moments, we can inject positive change. That's when we actually need people to stand up. That's when people need to say something. It happens sometimes in a classroom. It sometimes happens in a board meeting. Sometimes it happens and you know it's there. And your choice in that moment, when you feel that little thing raising up in your chest, is to start to learn to feed that, to learn to actually allow it to speak for itself. And it will guide you. And you'll be all right. I'm okay. So right around when I first moved to Philadelphia, a curator named Sid Sachs asked me to put on a show, and I said yes. I was literally in boxes, like opening stuff up, and I was thinking about a show. And I thought about the show and this idea of a show called The Dangerous One. And it would be about the way in which we as Americans tend to minimize violence and violence in our history. And everything works in an anecdotal fashion. So it'd be like the one about the Pilgrims, the one about the criminal Andrew Jackson, and then the one about George Washington. So that is a piece that you guys have. And George Washington, for me, is a very interesting figure. He's also was my height, around 6'3", very strong person, one of the wealthiest landowners in all of America, and also the first president. Well, okay, we won't get into technicalities because, you know, there were other people who were put in position. Okay, whatever. But as we go by the narrative, the first president. Emanuel Lutz makes this painting, Washington Crossing, Delaware in 1851. It's a painting that's over in the Met in New York City. It's a massive painting. There's not many paintings, and I'm always amazed when I see an American painting that's of certain scale, and it always kind of like, it means a lot to me. It's kind of like, wow, that's epic. So when I look at this painting and when I think about what this work means to me, I started to think about like, well, how can I retrace that? How can I rethink it? And as I started doing more information, gain more information about this painting, I started to find out that it's not actually the original. The original painting was made in 1849. It's of a different quality. If you can look at the two, there's like differences in the water, differences in the people, but still the same message. Every person inside of that boat represents a certain person from a different group. So there's a Scotsman, there's actually a black fellow in the foreground who's rowing the boat. I mean, what is he? You have like Irish people, you have like all different people who supposedly are the people who've made up America, German and everything. And you even have a woman who's actually rowing one of the oars. In the back of the boat, the person steering the boat is a Native American, all right? That painting was destroyed during one of our attacks in Berlin during World War II. The story goes that the painting was on loan. I've heard multiple tales. It was on loan from us, it was on loan from someone else in Germany, whatever have you. But I think it's very strange to think that this object in the 1850s, 1880s, or during certain time around like German Enlightenment, then to like 100 years later, basically is being bombed by us, which is also an image that's talking about our freedom, which is also around this idea around this event that's happened on Christmas Eve. And all of a sudden I'm living within like, 30 minutes away from this event. So I wanted to recast it. I wanted to rethink it. I wanted to change the orientation of some of the characters. I wanted to bring mythological creatures into it. I wanted to have like a black body being dragged along rather than just going along with it. Rather than having a Native American steering the ship, I wanted to have the Grim Reaper. I wanted to speak to some of the truths, some of the things that happened actually that day, how violent that day was when fighting the Hessians, how horrible it was to be in that cold and the wet, and how insane some of the stuff was that was going down there. What it took for a lot of wealthy individuals to get a lot of poor individuals together to mount up as forces to take down one of the most like powerful empires in the world, and sometimes in many ways against their own interests, is something I think is extremely important, especially important to what's happening to us today. I know I'm probably running over, but I just want to like quickly go through some others. This is the one about the Klansmen in Hell. This is the one about liberty. Imagining one of the characters in there is actually a representation of my grandfather who died in the Korean War. Idea of a Black Statue of Liberty. If you know anything about liberty, or the Statue of Liberty as a gift to America post the Civil War, that some of the early renditions of liberty were actually of a Black woman. And the French kind of knew what was up with Americans and probably knew that that probably wouldn't fly. Got Huey Newton. We have the idea of the Spirit of 76 actually being performed by Black bodies, because we did take part in the revolution. We've taken part in every war in American history, usually fighting with the ideal for freedom, even when we had none. Klux Kettle, the one about media. This became also the poster for the show. The one about Trump is a dragon. I have to do a new one for that one. Maybe the Dragon Slayed. This was an install of some works, the idea of the New Year, Happy New Year. This was for 2019 when I did this. And actually I made a physical flag of the Negro Rifle Association. Something I was very proud of, something it took a long time for me to do, because I felt it was important to actually have this physical, real thing, even though I'm talking about this idea. Now, the idea of the Negro Rifle Association, because I have to get to this, I had this idea that like if I, or an African American, started buying AK-47s and started selling them to other African Americans, most likely they would ban assault rifles. The NRA is an extension of the Ku Klux Klan in its foundation. And so when it was formed, some of the first policies they did were to ban African Americans owning guns. So its relationship to race and to take their symbol or take their imagery and to recontextualize it, that it's all in good thinking. But one thing I wanted to do with this shirt was the idea of like getting people to buy it. Now, a lot of times when you're an artist and you start selling swag at your opening, everyone thinks that you're just kind of like some person who's just trying to grab money. But the reality of it is that I wanted to have something that people would purchase, they would own, and then they would have to they have to deal with it. And that when you have to contend with something like that, you either put it on and you wear it and you don't really think much of it, or you put it on, you wear it and you think about it, or you keep it in your drawer and you look at it and you say, I can't do that. I'm not that. Solidarity, allyship, things that we use, words that have been used in the last, I don't know, 5 to 6 years, are being pushed to a certain place of where we need to start really thinking about what those things mean and what does it look like. Can you walk in my shoes? Can you even walk next to my shoes? Will you walk behind my shoes? I don't know. But that's something that every individual needs to ask themselves individually. This is a part of a project about Conrad and Conrad. Conrad is a Klansman who, now as the story is developed, dies at a monument, a Confederate monument that's being torn down. He's crushed by it. He ends up in hell. He finds his great-great-grandfather, Conrad I, who was a civil rights, who was a Civil War Confederate. He ends up having to basically just escape out of hell so they can help get their ballots in for the election. Quickly go through the last few images. Imagery that I started making about being back home in Miami, growing up in Florida. Recent works that began to kick off this year. A lot of ideas around like white bodies actually fighting for freedom. Something I've been thinking a lot about. This one I did for John Lewis prior to his passing. I had the opportunity of meeting John Lewis, and he imparted some amazing words on me. and then work that started to deal with COVID. And that's where my work kind of has come to this moment. So with that, and I know I took up a lot of time, hopefully I didn't go way over, but I just kind of wanted to give you a full understanding of what I do. So I'm open to hearing any questions that you have, and please, I will answer as best to my ability. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate that context. Super powerful and super helpful in terms of your work and all of your story in terms of who you are as an artist today. We have a couple students who are here, actually members of our Black Student Union this year, that are really excited to ask you a few questions. Some that have come in beforehand, but also if you have a question that you would like, if you're watching at home, feel free to use the Q&A option that's there. And you can send those questions in, and if we have enough time, we'll make sure that Mark gets them. And if not, we'll be able to send them to him later on as well too. We have again, a couple more minutes, but wanted to get a couple of questions. And if you don't mind, Mark, if that's...
No, not at all. Like, I can stay here all day if you want. Ask me whatever.
Sounds good. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to the members of the Black Student Union to ask their questions. So go ahead now. You can start off.
Okay. Hello. My name is Sanaa Retman,
Sanaa.
and I'm this year's Black Student Union president. Mr. Gibson, my question for you is, what is one thought or piece of advice you have for young people or young artists?
Okay, real simple. Something that I didn't really understand until later on. It took me until I went to grad school. And maybe it's just me, but I do see it happen a lot with young people. I was talking to this really smart professor, and he said to me, I was saying to him, like, so tell me he's always saying really positive things. I'm like, tell me one thing that you think I need, right? And the guy like looks at me. He has these really nerdy glasses. He takes them off. All of a sudden he looks like freaking like Superman. I'm like, whoa. And he goes to me and he says, like, you don't believe in yourself. And I was like, phew, like it just like hit me, because I was like, whoa, like really? But it's true. And it was like, I've proven myself so many ways and so many days that I could do so many things. But truth, power, all the whole thing to you, just believe in yourself. Like really, you have to invest and believe in yourself. You have to believe in yourself more than anybody else will ever believe in you. And that doesn't mean about, there's the whole idea of like, yeah, we got to work twice as hard as other people. And we got to do what we got to do to get where we got to get. But at the core of that is a belief in yourself, because that's how you can love yourself. And that's how you can actually maintain yourself, how you feed yourself spiritually, so that when you make work and you start to do work and you start to move forward in your life, that you always will be taken care of. So that's one idea. Any other questions?
Yes. Hello, my name is Ayushali, and I'm a junior here at Shipley, and I am this year's vice president of the Black Student Union. And
Okay.
My question for you is, can you talk a little bit about how young people and students like ourselves can start to use our voices in terms of art and activism? I
think that your generation more than my generation have a bigger rule set, a bigger sense of tools than we did when I came up. I mean, we had AOL, and that ain't much. Like we're talking about like 1 megapixel to send an image somewhere, and it would take like half an hour, and you hit clicking and everything. It was real sad, and you'd be happy when it happened. But your speed of information, the way it plays, the way it moves, the way it shifts, I think that the main thing to think about is when creating and developing content or information or developing art to go into the world, you have to control the duration of that encounter. Meaning Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all of that is an operation. It's a system that likes to take information in, and it goes for like likes, and it goes for like things and clicks and stuff like that. If you're not careful, it can take that type of information that you create and be like, oh, it doesn't care it doesn't care about politics, it doesn't care about your beliefs and all that stuff. It's just generating more content so it can sell ad dollars. But if you use it right, it can be used as a tool to actually help bring other people's ideas and focuses together. So I would say like the use of technology and actually being able to group up with other people And also we have to be kind to other people, because what happens with movements, I find, is that everyone gets all about it and everyone's like, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. And everyone's in the street, like, yeah. And then like a month passes, then you're out there by yourself and you're like, oh, what happened to everybody else? And it's like, oh, there's a new show on. And you're like, what? And so what you have to do is you have to also be kind to people and understand that like everyone has a certain proximity to certain language, to certain ideas, to certain experiences, and that some people are able to maintain and kind of work inside of something on a more steady basis than others. So when you work with people and you develop your language and you're making art that has that kind of content, allow for there to sometimes be and witness and listen to people who don't quite understand where you're coming from and maybe don't quite get what you're doing. But yeah, it takes time and it's additive. The earlier you start kind of playing with these ideas, it's like muscle memory. Like it just becomes easier and easier for you to speak in those terms, to think about it. Like I have moments when I have not been really reading enough, and then all of a sudden some younger activist person like comes up and they have like certain language that they're using, and I'm like, whoa, that's I don't know, that's like too much for me. And then it's like, oh, you need to go read, old man. And then I have to go read something, and then I have to like rethink my language, or have to rethink the condition of the situation that this individual is bringing to the table. So, it's a thing. But start young, I mean, I think when I was very young, you're probably your age, being a person of color, making work about being a person of color, people literally would just not talk about my work. And they would just like skip me. Or they'd be like, people would say to me straight up, like, what are you playing at? And I'm like, I'm not playing at anything. I'm just talking about me. I did this one drawing, a painting of myself as George Washington back before Barack Obama was president. And I was like, I thought it was kind of funny. It's like, cool, I'm the first Black president. And people got angry. They were like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And I'm like, what do you mean? What do I mean? And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, what is like, it's like, it shouldn't get you that hot, like, why? It's like, I'm just like, and, and it kind of pushed me away from dealing with work like that. And, and I was like, well, maybe there's no place for me in art if I can't be myself. But that's just because some people are ignorant and they don't really know what is out there. And they're afraid because then they don't have power. Don't squash them. That doesn't matter. Keep moving, grow.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Mr. Gibson. I have a question for you. My name is Peyton Turner. I'm a junior here at Shipley, and I'm the secretary of the BSU this year. Good segue to what you answered before, but how do you respond to people who see your work as divisive or believe art shouldn't be political?
That is actually sadly a condition of our culture. Outside of this culture, and like when I started showing my books or my comics or my work and out like in Europe or whatever, sadly, you'll have to go over there in France or somewhere. They'd be like, "Oh, you're an artist," and I'd be like, "Excuse me," and they'd be like, "It's like," they were like, it was like reverence, and I was like, and it's like because their cultures have a lot of a strong history of art being used as a part of their political movements. It is being used here in our culture, but yet usually people don't buy it. So way capitalism functions inside of America, that something is only valid because it's been purchased. Something is valid because there's a numerical amount attached to it. So then ergo it matters. That's extremely problematic. That devalues ideas. That means that only things that, there's a reason why some celebrities who have done absolutely nothing can be multi-billionaires. And what do they really bring to the table or the conversation? That's something that you have to question. So when I realize that that's a condition, if I'm aware enough, mentally aware enough to see the game or to see the thing that's being played, then I have to reorient my perspective on it. So for me, making books and doing something that has the ability of being multiple, to be duplicated, that can be exchanged, that can flow around the world, that can go in people's hands in all these different ways, I'm using the idea of the commodifiable object against itself. Take the power, is like judo. You take that energy, you take that force, and you turn it on itself. It'll use its weight against itself. As you do that, as you start to shifting the way that where energy flows like that, you don't extend as much energy just trying to beat it up, trying to hit your head against it. You'll break yourself that way. So I started having to think about how do I change that flow, that direction of stuff. So when people come to me and they're like, why all this political stuff? Why are that? And it's like, it isn't about me. When someone comes to you with that kind of thing, it's not about you. It's about them. It's about that it makes them uncomfortable. It's not about you. And so like when you have to what you learn and when you can kind of do that as the first step in an encounter like that it's not about, you don't go up to their level. I rarely emotionally shift my level to another individual's level. I always try to keep my level so that I'm in control of what I say and what I do. So that when someone changes their level, then I'm paying attention to them. And then then I shift the energy. Simple. Takes time. No, thank you. That was a great question.
Thank you, Mark. We have one last question here, if you don't mind, just with our time here. And it's a curious one that I think some people might be asking because you've imparted so much knowledge, but totally curious about, a little different way of asking this. But is there, Becky's asked, and it's a great question, about any musical artist or group that either informed or influenced you? And then kind of like on that same note, what's on your Friday night playlist, right? Like what's on there that people can hear in terms of getting inspiration in terms of either music or groups that are out there?
Well, it's complicated for me, music, because there's music from my youth that I think about, like Rage Against the Machine was really popular when I was a kid, or like NWA and all that kind of stuff, because that was like the stuff that was when I was a kid, that was like, ah. And then there's like Kendrick Lamar, because it's like at times when his music has come about that there's just certain things that he says or certain things that he's done that it just hit right on the note. That's like, and I can still think about, and it still has revelations there. Stevie Wonder a lot, actually, when I just need to come into the studio and get readjusted. But I think music for me is a very strange thing. Like I usually don't play music out loud. Most people don't know what I actually listen to. I usually have my earbuds in, even when like I'm by myself. And I listen to more audiobooks than anything. There's a great audiobook on the life of Frederick Douglass that just came out from a professor out of Yale that I've been listening to. Yeah, audiobooks more than I actually listen to music. I was telling someone about that recently. I like information. I'm constantly just absorbing like history, knowledge, and content, and it brings me joy. But yeah, sometimes I do have to just like go down the playlist and I have to listen to like, Run the Jewels or something just to like, freshen it up. Yeah, Killer Mike. I like Killer Mike for sure.
There you go. Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate it. I just wanted to, again, thank you for your time here today, and thank you for imparting so much wisdom in terms of your work and your experience. We really, really appreciate it. I just want to also thank as well to Paige and Lee as well too for bringing you to us and bringing your work to our community. We've really enjoyed it, and our students have enjoyed it as well too. And I want to also thank Tonto O'Donnell and Melissa Kuiper and for their help with putting this together today. We hope that everybody's enjoyed their experience and really enjoyed listening to you and can check out more from you later on in the future, and we look forward to hopefully hearing and seeing you more again really soon. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I just, as we wrap up here, everybody, thank you again for joining us. I wanted to make one last quick plug about another presentation that's actually going on tonight that's in the same vein of the conversation we had today, which is actually what we call Beautiful Trouble, which is this year's fall plays, but it's a virtual production. And it'll be an evening of kind of protest theater in the form of short film. There'll be students from our honors jazz combo. There'll be different monologues, spoken word, protest songs that really express their outrage of our students and our community and the passion about many of the social and cultural issues that have divided and plagued our nation, such as gender equity, racial injustice, mental health, sexual abuse, and much, much more. If you're interested, I believe in the chat, we're gonna drop a link that you can see that tonight, but that'll be also shown and be recorded, and it's pre-recorded, so if you'd like to see it later on, on, you can definitely check that out as well too. So we definitely recommend you doing that, and appreciate you you supporting our strong and great and really courageous theater department for putting on such a great show this year. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thanks again to Mark and Lee and Paige and our student presenters and questioners here today. We hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and a great holiday season. We look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care.
BSU, if you need anything, get at me, all right? Oh yeah, and Prince, Purple Rain, I got you. All right.
Have a great day, everybody.